Shri Radha Murlidhar ki, Shri Shri Gaura Chandra ki, Srila Prabhupada ki. Hare Krishna, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. Even I feel like December is probably the least amount of people because it's such a holiday season. Thank you so much for coming, and special welcome to Flo, Zach, and Bob, who are joining us from the 300-hour YTT Advanced Bhakti Yoga training. You can say Haribo! And everyone else who's here. We have a very wonderful, wonderful speaker today. Hari Vilas is a very, very deep and dedicated and intelligent, shastric, and humble devotee. And he's originally from South Africa, has a very wonderful family that he's very close with. And he is a disciple of Kadamba Swami in South Africa. He did a lot of services such as outreach, sharing Krishna consciousness with others, and there's quite a few devotees from South Africa in our community actually, who are kind of like a tribe that ended up here in New York, which is quite special. And Kadamba Swami was very involved in the Brooklyn Temple, which you were saying you've been to the Brooklyn Temple, and Kadamba Swami asked you, right? Asked you to come and serve the Brooklyn Temple. He lived in the Brooklyn Temple for many years. He was a brahmachari student for many years and became vice president of the Brooklyn Temple. He got married to a very beautiful soul, Sukhanti Gaurangi, who unfortunately can't be with us today. And he continues while working a job to continue to do that service for the Brooklyn Temple and develop the community and inspire the devotees there. And I know he is deeply read in our scriptures and really always shares a lot of very enlightening and practical words for us to digest and take into our lives. So thank you so much for being here, Prabhu.
Jai.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Ajnati Mirandasya Jananjana Shalakaya Chakshurumritam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Sthapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Gadamayam Dadati Swagadantikam Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Cha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Srivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you so much. So, always nice to be here at the Bhagavat Sravanam and have the opportunity to just focus a bit on the Srimad Bhagavatam and to have that freedom to just, what's nice about these classes is that you can choose whatever you want to speak about. So we have Bhagavatam class every morning at the temples, and then we just go through verse by verse. And sometimes you're lucky, you get a nice verse, sometimes you get a verse that's, maybe not exactly where you're at the moment. But what's nice about these Sunday classes is that you can just choose whatever you want. And that is always good because, in general, we'll see that in our lives, when it comes to the scripture, as we develop a relationship with the Bhagavatam, with the Bhagavad Gita, it will also depend on where we're at in our life, what we're struggling with, what we're thinking about, what we're meditating upon. And that's really not what scripture is supposed to be like. It's supposed to be like a companion. We see that one of the great commentators in our tradition, Sanatana Goswami, he wrote, him and his brother were saints in the Middle Ages, so they were just after Lord Chaitanya. They were the direct disciples of Lord Chaitanya, and they were tasked with writing a lot of books and commentaries in the scriptures. And Sanatana Goswami wrote this amazing sets of prayers towards the Bhagavatam, and then he refers to the Bhagavatam as his friend and his constant companion. Very interesting how, when it comes to scripture, because we understand that scripture is a manifestation of God. It's a way that God is with us as we travel through life. And it is a companion, just like as you walk, as you go on a journey, if you ever walk very far, if you walk with someone, it's much easier. So you have someone to be with you, someone to carry you, it gets a little difficult, someone to keep you company. And in this way also, the Bhagavatam as a companion is a very interesting meditation. And when we regularly read and study, we'll see that it will become relevant to where we are at our life. So I want to take a look today at a section of verses from the Bhagavatam. So let's just hear about who regularly reads the Bhagavatam. Get an idea of what's happening here. Okay. Now, what about Bhagavad Gita? You guys must be a little bit in Bhagavad Gita. Okay. So so we're familiar with the Bhagavad tradition, and we see that all these scriptures, they are always, 100% of the time, they are conversations that are taking place. And you can see that sometimes the Bhagavatam is a little difficult. Bhagavad Gita is easy because it's just two people, and you can sort of keep track of who's saying what. But the first time you read the Bhagavatam, it gets a little confusing because there's these conversations within conversations, and someone asks someone something, and then they'll say, oh yes, I was once in a conversation where someone else also asked this question, and then there's this other conversation that takes place. So it can sometimes get a little confusing when you read it, to know who's saying what and where exactly are you now. But when you study the Bhagavatam, you'll see that actually, in the beginning, in our exposure to scripture, we might find these individual verses that we find speaks to us. So in all my Bhagavad Gita, we find these verses that are very powerful, and that's why these verses are nice, because it's these short, terse pieces of philosophy, these bit-sized things can sometimes really speak to us, and we can memorize these little verses, and we develop these relationships. And I'm sure if I ask you, name me some Bhagavad Gita verses, some of them will come to mind. You might not know where exactly they are, or what comes before it and what comes afterwards, but the individual verses we have some relationship with. But in the Bhagavatam, we'll see that at a certain point as we study, there's these whole conversations. There's these conversations, and a next step in our journey of reading the Bhagavatam is not just connecting with the individual verses, but in understanding what's happening in the conversation. Someone will ask a question, and then there will be a response, and that response might be 20 or 30 verses, but they're all actually connected. And then as we start to study, we'll get into these conversations that have a specific theme and a specific focus, and that's actually very exciting to see how all these verses are all connected. Just like an individual flower is very beautiful, but when you have a flower that's connected on a string in a garden, it becomes something even more beautiful. So similarly, these conversations, they're like flowers that are all garlanded together that make like something even more beautiful than just the individual flower itself. So I want to look today at a section of verses. For those of you who have your phones, you want to also check it out. It's the 4th canto of the Bhagavatam, chapter 22, which is a conversation between Prithu Maharaj and Sanat Kumara. So Prithu Maharaj in the Bhagavatam, he is the archetypical king, the archetypical leader the statesman, we can call it, this time a king. And there's a whole story, many chapters that deal with his life and how he appeared at a time of great government mismanagement, a huge government disaster, because there was a very evil king. And then he made his appearance. The sages ended up deposing the prior king. They killed him with all kinds of mantras. And then the new king was installed, Monarch Prithu, who was very great, and his qualities are described and his activities in many verses. But then at the end, after we hear his story, there's these two conversations back to back. And the one is where the king speaks to his citizens and he instructs his citizens. It's very interesting to see, because in these instructions, that's how you get a glimpse into the mind and the mentality of what the Bhagavatam considers to be the ideal leader to be. What is his priorities? What is he saying? Just like if you have a child and your child comes to you for advice and you instruct your child in those instructions, those desires and that values that you want to carry over to your child, that is going to be where you can really see where a person is at, what state of mind you have, because that's obviously what you want for your children. Is like, that's going to be what's really deep is in your heart, what's most important to you, and what you desire and what you want for them, that will come out of the heart, and it will come out when you try to instruct them and guide them in life. That will come out. So we see that then the king, he speaks to his citizens and he encourages them, and many wonderful instructions there. And then the next chapter is when the king meets a sage, and the sage comes to his kingdom, and then the sage instructs the king, which is very interesting. And then we see how the king is also on the receiving end of instructions, because that's the amazing thing with the spiritual culture, is not that there's no one person on top telling everyone what to do. Everybody has someone everyone has a spiritual master. And the qualification for being a spiritual master is that that person itself has a strong relationship with his guru. So there's no such thing as someone who is a guru but not a disciple. Yeah? There has to be that chain, and that's what provides the integrity. Yeah? And we see that when you have rogue spiritual leaders, sometimes, if you look at the 60s, 70s in America, so much crazy stuff happened, when there's all these gurus and communes and all kinds of crazy teachers doing all kinds of weird stuff, and they might have wore their saffron robes and, had a beard and done all kinds of stuff. And then, all kinds of weird things happen, just like you can see on Netflix, or all kinds of interesting shows that are being made about it. And, but then, if you look at them, and you will see, then you ask them, how did that happen? And people say, oh, that's what happens if you have a guru. That's why gurus are very dangerous. Because if there's a guru, it means he can exploit his disciples and all these things. No. If you look at those gurus, you'll see they're all people who had themselves no connection with any tradition, actually. They were not disciples themselves. They had just somehow seen the light or whatever it is, and then they assumed that position of guru, and somehow they convinced a bunch of people to follow them. But because they themselves were not protected, they were not themselves trained by a superior personality, they were not sheltered by a tradition, by a spiritual master, then it becomes very funky. It can get very funky. And but we see no, in proper spiritual culture, it is always a line. He who is now the spiritual master, he was trained. Someone who occupies the position of guru, at some point he was a disciple, and he had to learn, and he studied under someone. And so it goes all the way back up to God himself, and that connection, and that provides that integrity that avoids hierarchies from becoming exploitative, and where everybody is protected, because everybody ultimately is trying to serve, and there is not a principle that one person is lording over another and abusing their power and authority, which is the biggest problem we have today, across the board, and all fields and all sectors of human endeavor. The problem is that we cannot avoid the fact that some people will have to have power. That's how the world works. Someone will have to decide and guide us in any institution. There's some form of authority that will be there, but the problem is that authority degrades, and you have wrong people in authority who abuse that authority, even if they might end up in those positions with good intentions. But then good intentions, unfortunately, are not enough, and has to be protected. So in these two chapters, very interesting. So we see Prithu speaking to his citizens, and then we see himself, the king, taking in a position of subservience and inquiring from a spiritual teacher. And that very fascinating how that cycle is is completed. So in this section, he asks a very interesting question, and he starts his, the sages appear there, and the king, he asks them some wonderful questions. But his main question was, he said, he inquired from the sages, but what about those people who are entangled in this dangerous material existence because of their previous karma, and whose only aim is sense gratification? How can these people be blessed with any good fortune? So his concern was, what about us? And that's us. Our main danger in this life is that we are conditioned. We are conditioned. We are ultimately, you can say, almost like a disease that we have. It's that we are conditioned by the material energy. And it means that we are attached to that which is temporary. And it goes very deep. Our attachment is extremely deep. And from that simple attachment to that which is temporary, so much anxiety, so much fear, so much anger, and on the other side, so much exploitation, so much violence. It's all rooted in the fact that the soul, which is eternal, is now completely addicted and attached to something which is not permanent. It starts with the permanent body, or the impermanent body, which is temporary, which is just a vehicle that we're traveling through for this life. But so deep does that attachment go. And from that attachment, all the problems come. Whether it's individual problems or whether it's also our own personal failings and mistakes that we make. And we see in the Bhagavad Gita that is repeated again and again, the danger of the senses, which is explained to us. And this is not something that you have to go look far. Interesting, I saw, sometimes you see these examples that are just so poignant, as they say, and sometimes very aggressive. I saw this clip of a guy in Brooklyn. I don't know if you've ever seen these YouTube channels, the guys who are repossession men. So it's guys that if people don't pay their cars or their property has to be repossessed, these guys have to go with a tow truck, and then they have to go and find the car and then tow it. And obviously you can imagine that there can be a lot of sparks that can fly. So this repo guy, he went, and some guy, he had to repossess the person's car, and it was this huge, big black truck. And when the repo guy came, the guy wasn't there because they have the authority. They just hook that thing up and they take it, because they find it, they hook it, and they take it, because technically it's not that person's property anymore. So as he was hooking this thing up, the guy came out and he just flipped out. This huge guy, he flipped out. He threw the repo guy out of his truck because the truck was already lifted up. So he threw the guy out of his truck. He climbed into the truck that has so his truck was connected to the tow truck. So he climbed into the repo guy's tow truck and he sped away. But as he sped away, his car wasn't properly connected and his door was open. And he slammed probably into 6-7 cars. He ruined his own car. He ruined 6-7 other cars. And then he speeds away with the tow truck. And then you're asking yourself, God, how did he think that is that is the proper answer to the situation? Going from just having your truck repossessed to now basically causing thousands of dollars of property damage and having a criminal case against you. And that's what can happen. That's what can happen if anger takes over. The problem is the guy, he got overwhelmed by anger, and then what happens is that the intelligence just shuts off. And then people can do the craziest stuff when they're angry. And this is exactly what the Bhagavad Gita is warning us against, saying, listen, you have to understand that you are here now, and a part of you is able to think and decide what you want to do and think about your best interest. But there's another part of you that is so connected to lower base emotions, and that you can very easily become overwhelmed by these things. So anger is one of them. The other archetypical desire, sexual desire. Think about how many people have ruined their lives, ruined their lives by either cheating on their spouse or doing all kinds of crazy stuff. So that's what the Bhagavad Gita is warning us against. That, hey, we have to understand that we have to be very careful as we are moving through this world, because sometimes you can become overwhelmed. Not by something else outside of you, but by something inside of you that can take over. And sometimes it's also not that we do it to other people. We see something like anxiety or fear. It's just you do it to yourself. you get so stressed out, and you get so caught up in fear and anxiety, and sometimes we see that people get panic attacks and stuff. It actually at some point it's not even connected really with reality. There's not really something to be afraid of, but you get in such a state where you're so afraid, and then that fear actually just totally breaks you down, ruins your health, ruins your lifespan, ruins your relationship, because the whole time you're just absorbed in fear. So these things are very dangerous. So the Bhagavad Gita warns us: attachment, fear, and anger. These are three obstacles that if these things take you, and you can't keep a grip on them, they can take you down. They take your consciousness down, and it's very, very risky. So in this conversation, Preeti Maharaj is asking for people like us who are struggling with the senses, struggling with lower conditioning as well. What is, how can good fortune, how can we obtain good fortune? And then there's a whole conversation then, and I won't go through the whole conversation. I wanted to specifically look at one section of verses that I found very interesting, and I want to just start from there. So, as Sanat Kumara was explaining, giving his answer to the king, he starts with this what I was describing now. One has to start with what is really the dangerous position of being conditioned, and how one has to be very cautious, and explain this dynamic of how the soul can become overwhelmed by that material connection. So he says that therefore, let's see this verse quickly. He says, it has been conclusively decided in the scriptures, after due consideration, that the ultimate goal for the welfare of human society is detachment from the bodily concept of life, and increased and steadfast attachment for the Supreme Lord, who is transcendental and beyond the modes of material nature. So he starts with that, to understand basically the root cause of prosperity, of a good life, of auspiciousness in your life. The basis of that is to become more detached from what is temporary and what is not real, which means attachment, fear, and anger, to take a distance from these things, to lessen the influence that these things have in your life, and to at the same time increase your attachment and connection to what is transcendental, to what is eternal, which is God and the soul and your ultimate eternal nature. That's very simple. It's those two things. If these two opposing forces, the push towards eternality and the push towards the temporary. And the root cause of auspiciousness is in moving from one direction to the other. And we have that famous verse from the I can't remember if it's from the Rig Veda, it says Tamasa Jyotir, what's it, how is it?
Tamasa ma jyotir
Gamaha.
Mrityurma Mrityur Gamaya something.
Yeah. I don't understand you hear it, but it explains that one has to go from darkness to light, from the temporary to the eternal, from suffering to happiness. That's what the human life gives us the opportunity to do that. And that's what we always have to keep in mind. As you go through your whole life, as you set up your whole life and you ask these questions like, what is my career? Who am I going to marry? Where am I going to live? All these things that we all have to do. But while you're struggling with these questions, trying to figure out your life, keep in mind that overarching purpose of your life is to move more towards the light, to move away from the darkness, to move towards bliss, to move away from suffering, and to move towards the eternal, to move away from the temporary. That is how everything can be set up with this goal in mind. And it's interesting when you start making your decisions in life with this ultimate perspective, how things start to change. Even the basic things like your career and so many things become influenced, because then certain careers, they offer you the opportunity to have more free time, or have a more flexible schedule, whatever. But the ultimate goal is that you want to maximize your time that you can spend on cultivating the connection with the eternal. And same thing, certain careers, they're gonna more deeply grind you in that lower aspects of yourself. Like, and again, it depends on your personal power. Some people are fine, but if you go to certain things, like you read about that guy who was it just not so long ago in an investment banker, and I think he was only 30 or something, and then he died, just dropped dead in the office because he was working like 100 hours a week or something, and it was like this whole thing that came out, and people were like, how is it even legal to have someone work for so many hours a week? But that's just a general culture. So then, if you look at a career like that, and if anyone is in investment banking, I'm saying don't do it, but I'm saying you have to consider that is going to have a huge toll on your mental reserves and your capacity to think about anything else except doing this one thing. So the general overarching aim of life then is this: let's go towards the light, move away from the darkness, and let's keep the eternal in mind. But then he explains further, goes through some basic instructions that one has to do, and he comes to these verses, which I want to look at specifically now, which is 2 verses in which he gives not a simile, but an idiom. We have Janata as a poet, he'll correct us here about what's the right term for this. So I'll maybe read it. And he explains that when one's mind and senses are attracted to sense objects for enjoyment, the mind becomes agitated. And as a result of continually thinking of sense objects, one's real consciousness almost becomes lost, like the water in a lake that is gradually sucked up by the big grass straws on its bank. The image that he gives. And again, for us, mightn't be so familiar with it, but I know in South Africa, where I was from, you get rivers, and at some point from Australia, the eucalyptus tree came there. The eucalyptus tree, you all know eucalyptus oil, but it's actually huge trees. They grow extremely big, and they're very hardy, and they can grow like in anything, because what they do is they have these massive root systems that just go like very far, and they can crack through like hard earth, because Australia is a tough place to survive. So if it can survive in Australia, it can survive anywhere. But what it can do is, if there's too much eucalyptus tree on a river, that thing can literally suck that whole river dry. It can just go, those trees just grow straight underneath, and it can suck all the water up. And sometimes that's what they had to do. You had to go and you had to cut all the eucalyptus trees so that they don't freaking, drink eat up the whole river before it gets downstream. So this image there of how if you have a lake of water, and if there's too much grass, specific grasses that grow, too much plants, then they can end up sucking out all the water, and at the end you have this empty lake. And what happens then if the lake becomes empty? What happens if the mind becomes empty? If the mind becomes so absorbed and caught by something that all your mental reserves drain away? When one deviates from his original consciousness, he loses the capacity to remember his previous position or recognize his present one. When remembrance is lost, all knowledge acquired is based on a false foundation. And when this occurs, learned scholars consider that the soul is lost. So the topic comes from this idea of lost souls, which is so interesting, because in one sense the soul is eternal, it can never be destroyed, but you see this image sometimes happen where they say the soul is destroyed, the soul is lost, which is figuratively saying that the soul, if the mind becomes so gripped by whether it's attachment, fear, or anger. So one has to understand, it's not just greed, or when the Bhagavatam speaks about the mind becoming attached to enjoyment, it's not necessarily that we're just thinking about food or whatever. It means that we become so gripped by thinking about the temporary material conditions and obsessing about how we want the world to be in a certain way. We want the world to be in a certain way. We want the world to be organized according to our preference. Whether at that point it means something enjoyable or something safe or something that doesn't give us anxiety, or when it comes to anger, we want other people to act in a different way than what they're currently acting. So when we become so obsessed, ultimately, with wanting the world in a specific way, then that can suck up so much of our mental energy. And when the mind becomes empty, what happens then is then your capacity to remember becomes wiped out. Just like we saw with that guy with the truck. He became so furious about the fact that his car was being repossessed, and he didn't want that. He wanted the world to be different. He could not stand the fact that now something is happening which he doesn't want to happen. And the anger became so intense, and it absorbed his full consciousness, became absorbed in this anger. And what happened is he lost the ability to remember. He lost the ability to think, what's going to happen? What's going to happen if you do this? You're going to go to jail. You're going to get... He couldn't remember that. It became completely eclipsed, you know? Which is crazy, because any normal person would look at that and understand that that is just the dumbest thing to do ever. Like, it's just such a dumb thing to do. There's no benefit in that. But he couldn't remember, because the soul was lost. The mind became sucked dry. And all that's left is either that anger or that fear and that attachment. And then what happens is, one gets taken. And this thing can take you, and it's like a sequence of events that kicks in, and then it goes. And I just want to read this purport from Prabhupada, which is very interesting, and he explains a little bit about this dynamic of the soul getting lost. Purport: the living entity of the soul is ever existing and eternal. It cannot be lost. But learned scholars say that it is lost when actual knowledge is not working. That is the difference between animals and human beings. According to less intelligent philosophers, animals have no soul. But factually, animals have souls. Due to the animals' gross ignorance, however, it appears that they have lost their souls. Without the soul, a body cannot move. That is the difference between a living body and a dead body. When the soul is out of the body is called dead. The soul is said to be lost when there is no proper knowledge exhibited. Our original consciousness is Krishna consciousness, because we are part and parcel of Krishna. When this consciousness is misguided and one is put into the material atmosphere, which pollutes the original consciousness, one thinks that he is a product of the material elements. Thus one loses his real remembrance of his position as part and parcel of the Supreme Lord, just as a man who sleeps forgets himself. In this way, when the activities of proper consciousness are checked, all the activities of the lost soul are performed on a false basis. At the present moment, human civilization is acting on a false platform of bodily identification. Therefore, it can be said that the people of the present age have lost their souls, and in this respect, they are no better than animals. So, this principle of the soul being lost means that we actually go back to an animal platform on which our base instincts take over. And if you look at animals, you see animals are very much, they're not dead, they have the same soul as we have. They have at the root the same desires that we have. You know, they want to be happy, they don't want to avoid misery, they have friends, they like to play, they have the same natural capacities of the soul. But because the animal body is the instincts are so strong, and the intelligence is not developed enough, the animal is completely at the whims of his instinct. Like 100%. There's no capacity for the animal to think, is this going to be good? Is this going to be bad? What's the consequences of this? Not just for himself, but even for others. And you see sometimes I once did a class on nature, because a lot of times people, especially now, it's such a marketing ploy. If things are natural, then things are good. And natural, if something is natural, is good. But anything can be natural. Walking around naked can be natural, or so many things can be natural. And people go natural is good. But then you look at nature, and nature is not all good. Yeah, you see what happens, what animals do to one another. Yeah? And they do it not, interestingly enough, most of our animals, they don't do it out of cruelty. They just do it because they just have no capacity to consider what the other creature is going through. It just doesn't come up to them. You see these clips of a deer being eaten by a lizard, and the deer is alive, and the lizard is just there, eating away, and the deer is screaming.
You mean a lion?
A lizard, no, one of those Komodo dragons. So, a big Komodo dragon, I saw a clip, and it was just, that's one of the clips that I showed to show, but what is this? This is also natural. Is this good? Do we say that should we make this part of our society? Is this something that we want humans also to do to one another? And, but it's not that the lizard is being cruel, the lizard is simply hungry. He's just hungry. And he says, oh, this is something to eat, and I'm gonna eat it. And he just doesn't care. He cannot consider that, my God, what is this poor animal going through? It's just, he just doesn't have that capacity. So we see that animals, they are like us, they're just not developed enough to see certain things that we can see. So then we see humans, we have this added element of qualities like kindness, compassion, consideration, self-restraint, which is all based on us seeing more than just ourselves, seeing more than just our own desires, seeing more than just our own instincts. And that is a uniquely human capacity. And but when we get so overwhelmed and gripped by these obsessions that take us, these obsessions that are all related to the material energy, that spiritual capacity we have to think beyond ourselves, it gets reduced. And even, as I said, it's not just intense greed. It's not, oh, because you're so selfish that you're just thinking about making more money or having a car. No. Even something like fear and anxiety. And that's what you see when people have intense fear, that also makes you very selfish. It also focuses you the whole time to just be obsessed about your specific situation that you're afraid of. And it can have very bad consequences on your relationships. Because I don't know if you've been friends with someone that is always afraid. They're actually always thinking about themselves. Yeah? Like they have this they become so obsessed with themselves and their own situation, they're not even sometimes thinking about, hey, how are you doing? And that's such a basic part of friendship, is where for a certain point, if you're friends, if there's a good relationship, you have to be able, when you have a good friend, that friend is able to, for a temporary time, just put themselves aside, and then you look at you and say, well, how are you doing? Like what? Let's forget about, and you sometimes have these moments in a conversation where someone says, okay, enough about me, like how are you doing? And that's nice to have a friend like that, who can for a moment put themselves aside and then just ask, well, how are you doing? But these obsessions, attachment, fear, and anger, they mean that you cannot do that. You cannot even put yourself aside for a moment, and have so many interesting impacts on your relationships and connecting with people, because you're just always going to be obsessed with whatever you're afraid of, whatever you're angry about, or whatever you are attached to. So as we become more elevated in spiritual life, as we practice and we become more attached to the eternal, these things slacken. These obsessions we have are temporary. Not that we become unconcerned about them, but they lose that obsessive grip. They lose that capacity where it completely overwhelms you. You can put them in perspective. And you can sometimes see what you need to do about stuff, but you can also switch off and you can step back. And that opens up so much space in the mind, opens up the consciousness for higher considerations, opens us up to the spiritual qualities like compassion, kindness, care, patience. These things can only manifest if these lower level attachments start to slacken a bit. That makes the space for higher considerations to come in. And so it's very interesting then. But we'll see that then in the Bhagavatam, the question is, well, how do I do this then? How do I start loosening my grip on these obsessions we have, these attachments we have? And it's not so complicated, interestingly enough, even though it's such a strong force. The simple reality is that in the path of bhakti, and that's what makes the process of bhakti so unique, is that bhakti says that you do not necessarily have to, your main focus is not on cutting these things independent of the practice of at the same time just connecting with Krishna. Means that your attachment just has to be transferred to the eternal. And by just starting this practice, because we see in the beginning of this verse, of this conversation, where the king asks the sages, what can we do? What can we as conditioned souls do who are so anxious about the material energy? Then the sage's response is, he says that, well, these are very nice questions, and you're asking these questions for the benefit of everyone. And then he says this very interesting verse. He says, my dear king, you already have an inclination to glorify the lotus feet of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Such attachment is very difficult to achieve, but when one has attained such unflinching faith in the Lord, it automatically cleanses attachments from the core of the heart. So it's the simple nature of Bhakti Yoga, is that by just taking our energy and our time and our consciousness and redirecting it towards hearing and chanting about Krishna, about his instructions, coming together as devotees and doing kirtan, like have all these practices that are simply designed to take the consciousness and to direct it towards the eternal. By simply doing that, automatically the consciousness gets retracted from the lower level considerations, from that obsessions that we have. And by just continuing that practice, we will see that the attachment for the eternal becomes stronger and the attachment for the temporary starts to recede. And that is a real position of strength that we move into in the material world. And that really protects us so much from the inauspiciousness that can result from when these lower aspects of our nature can overcome us. And what happens is with time then the opposite happens. So just like we see, it's explained that the soul is lost when attachment, fear, or anger takes over, a similar element happens. The soul becomes found. And when we speak about self-realization, that's literally all that it is. It means that you realize yourself, who you are. Independent from these lower level desires, you realize that your actual nature is much higher and broader. And there's all these wonderful considerations that come into that heart, where we become concerned for the devotees, for our service, our spiritual practices. It's like there's this whole other world that opens up. And that is what self-realization means. When you really start seeing the world from the spiritual perspective, from the fact of who you are eternally, and not just seeing it through this lens, this filtered view, where you just see the world filtered through your own obsessions and attachments. And so when the soul becomes found and becomes self-realized, that is that ultimate simple goal. So very, very simple really, not overly complicated. You don't have to be a genius to understand these dynamics. We all experience it for ourselves on a day-to-day basis. But we see that it is not as simple, it's not simply an intellectual exercise. It's not simply just an element of rational logic, because it's actually really has to do with what's happening in the heart, with where the heart is rooted and what the heart is obsessed with. And that transformation has to take place by a powerful spiritual process. And that's really what the Bhagavatam is urging us to do. So, wonderful conversation. If you ever want to read it, as I said, a big part of connecting with the Bhagavatam is finding these conversations that we find inspiring, and we can really read them again and again and try to follow the flow, see how all the various verses connect and how they're really speaking. It's not just, sometimes it looks like just these random things that are being said. Actually, very specific points are being made. And that way, that is the next step up in our studies of Scripture, where we start looking at these specific conversations and try to really enter into the flow of those conversations and see where they're taking us. So those are a few thoughts I had on this principle of the soul getting lost and the soul getting found, and based on the Bhagavatam. So we have a few moments if anyone has either a question, or you can also share a reflection with us, or is there anything that was being said that you found very interesting that you'll take with you? It's always nice to hear what stood out for anyone. So I'll give you a few seconds to think about that.
We only have one microphone, so I couldn't take that microphone.
Oh, shit.
Thank you. Manohar.
Oh, you come too. Oh.
So you were talking about transferring the attachment from the material world to the divine. We still have roles to lead in life. We are friends, we might be in relationships, we might have professional relationships. In this tradition, how do we, continue doing those roles while transferring the attachment above?
It's a very good question. And if you read the Bhagavad Gita, you'll see it's the question that comes up again and again, is where when Krishna explains his basic principle to Arjuna, then that's his first question. It's like, well, but why should I engage with the world then at all? If the truth is that I'm ultimately spiritual, why should I engage with the world at all? And the reason for that is because this world is populated by other entities who are also connected to God. So it's not that if we transfer our attachment to God that we become cold and completely heartless towards the world around us, because the world is populated by other conscious beings who also are affected by what we do. So it just means that we open up, and when you see, okay, you have your parents, you have all these various relationships you have, but at the root, those people, they are also spiritual beings just like you are. So it's like we're not really taking away, but we're adding in a higher dimension of seeing. Just like when you have a child, if you have this child, then okay, it's a temporary relationship in one sense, and it's just based on, okay, they're the child and you're the parent. But the natural desire that you have is you think, well, I want what's best for this person. Same like with your friends. You know, you want your friends to be happy. You want what's best for your friends. But then what is best, if you understand, well, also a spiritual being. So just like a kid, I have to feed them and clothe them and do all these things for them. But at the same time, I also want them to be spiritually successful. I want them to also connect with God. So it's more that we open up this other dimension in our lives. And then we perform our duties from that platform. So when it comes to career and friendship and all these things, we add in that spiritual dimension and start to see them as more than just bodies, but start to see them also as themselves, spiritual beings that are going on their journey. And what can we do while we serve them in this temporary world with our other temporary duties that we have to do? What can we do at the same time to benefit them as much as possible, to become their well-wisher? So we see the principle in spiritual life is that the whole world becomes your family, because we see that the whole world, our relationship with people is not merely based on the body or on our national identities, but it's because we all share a common spiritual essence and we all share that relationship with God. So it actually, instead of closing us off from the world, it opens us to a deeper dimension that is even manifested right here in this world. We have to act on these principles and see what role we have to play even in this world, while at the same time we're cultivating that understanding of the eternal dimension. So the eternal dimension is right here. It also opens up as well as we look through it. So if you look at the Bhagavad Gita, that's the fascinating thing, that at the end it's this whole spiritual dialogue, but then Arjuna has to do what? He has to go fight his battle. He has to go into the world and do what he is supposed to do. So all of us, we have our battle to fight within this world while we're right here. And spiritual life doesn't mean turning away from that. It means going in and fighting that battle, keeping the ultimate in mind, keeping the ultimate purpose of life in mind, and adding that dimension to life, and not necessarily running away from it. That's really what makes bhakti so practical, and at the same time also more complete, because it doesn't deny the significance and meaning that is also here in this world, even while it is temporary. Does that make sense? Yes, Christina.
Hare Krishna, thank you so much. I always take so much away from what you share with us. I have two questions. One is quicker than the other. The first is, what do you say to yourself, maybe a prayer or just self-compassion, when you notice these impurities arise, and as you're observing them, whether it's anger, fear, envy? And my second question is, any advice you have for someone who wants to read it from the beginning for the first time?
The Bhagavad Gita. Good question. So, yes, firstly, when it comes, the beginning step is in being honest with ourselves. Being able to be honest with what's actually happening in the heart. Seeing all the stuff that's there, being able to say it for what it is. See, yep, I'm attached to this thing, I'm attached to that thing. Like you said, oh, I'm actually a little envious. Being honest with ourselves that when we have these things come up, we just see it for what it is. But at the same time, very important is to stay very calm. That's the first principle. You see the general attitude that is being given in the Bhagavad Gita is to stay very calm and tolerant, even with yourself, even with whatever our own shortcomings or failures. To become too aggressive and self-condemning is not actually productive at the ultimate end. One has to stay very calm and understand that what we can always just try to do is turn towards Krishna to make that connection, make that connection stronger, and from that we will get some energy, some strength, that we can work and deal with these things. But sometimes, it happens. So understanding and patience is not just to be directed towards others, but also be directed towards ourselves. And it's sometimes going to take a little while to work through these things. But the first step is the most difficult, which is just being able to be honest. And be honest with ourselves of where we're at and what's actually happening in the heart. And being able to see the good and the bad and call it like that. And say, okay, well, if you're like struggling with anxiety, for example, one of the main challenge that people with anxiety have is that they have to learn that their anxiety is exaggerated. That they're actually having an exaggerated response. Sometimes people get panic attacks. It's very difficult to accept that. It's very difficult to accept that. but you have to realize that it's not helping you. So that honesty is the first principle. Same thing with addiction. What's the first step with addiction? So you have to be honest and stand up and say, oh, if you go to AA meeting, what do you say? You say, my name is Hari Vilas and I'm an alcoholic. You have to be able to admit that, yes, I'm addicted. So the first step is just that honesty, being able to see what are my addictions and what are my weaknesses. And just from that basic honesty, that's really is the most difficult step. And then from there, we can just patiently work through it and make a plan. Make a plan of what we're going to do. And again, the most important thing is just adding more of the spiritual, because that will automatically cleanse the heart. It's explained just like if you have a glass of water and you put some ink in there. The ink, what can you do? You cannot take just the ink out. The easiest thing that you can do, you just keep adding water. If you keep adding clean water, the whole glass will overflow, and at some point the ink will be completely washed out and it will just be pure water again. So similarly, by just adding the positive as much as we can, positive association, positive spiritual practices, by adding as much as the positive as we can, the heart becomes full. And you just keep adding it, and at some point the heart becomes purified. And in the interim, we just sometimes have to tolerate when there's attachments and stuff is there, and also be patient with ourselves, because if we get too harshness is not a quality of the saintly, and either directed towards other to ourselves. So we have to be patient, honest, and at the same time confident that if I just keep doing the positive things and I keep fighting the good fight, things will get better, and I will actually be able to overcome these things if I just keep have my effort consistent. Your second question in terms of the Bhagavatam, there's the major challenge in the beginning is that a lot of it is going to be completely unfamiliar. Many unfamiliar names and these things, and the easiest thing to overcome that unfamiliarity is just to dive in. Don't be so worried about understanding everything that you're reading. Just say, I'm going to read through the whole thing once. And even if I understand only 25%, it's fine. Because it's like, it's not, we're used to learning stuff in our educational system where it's like very, you have like level 1, okay, it's like a factory. If you look at modern education, like a factory. So you're trying to assemble this thing. So what you do is there's level 1, you have your first year of school, and then you do your second year of school, and the idea is that you slowly manufacture this being that comes out the other end, and then you have all the stuff that you know. So it's like very linear, and how effective it is a question of a concern. But the Bhagavatam way is more, listen, you just dive into it, and you just hear it regularly, and then you slowly start to learn. It starts to make sense with time, which is actually, if you think about how you learned English, how you learned your native language. How did you learn your native language as a kid? Your first language you just hear by exposure. You just hear this word and that word, and then you start to make sense of this, you start to make sense of that, and slowly over time you assemble this whole understanding of the world. But it's not that you had to go to school to learn English. It just happens by exposure. So similarly, the Bhagavatam culture actually is just here. Just start with the beginning. Just read a few pages every day, and just keep moving on. And don't worry if it doesn't all make sense at the beginning. If you just keep hearing, it will start to make sense with time. You will pick more things up. Things will make more sense. And if you just you read it through, and what do you do when you reach the end? You just start over. You just start over again. And the next time you read it, you will understand much more. I've probably read the Bhagavatam maybe 4 or 5 times, and every time I read it, I see new things that I didn't see before, because I've heard something here, or I've heard something there. So again, just be very patient with yourself. Just dive in. Just dive into the Bhagavatam. Start reading from the beginning. Read consistent. That's the main thing. Just decide you read 10 minutes a day, 20 minutes a day, 30 minutes a day, however much you want to do. And then you just keep going. And just don't worry if you don't understand everything, because with time you will. The things will start to make sense. The names, you will start to recognize the names and know who is what. And Prabhupada speaks in one purport about the Vedic adventure. So I would say also with reading the Bhagavatam, don't approach it like you're studying your PhD or you're doing a master's degree. It's not an academic thing. You're not going to be tested at the end. It's not a problem. It's more like just an adventure. You just want to go into this world and just sort of discover whatever is there to discover. And if some things don't make sense, not a problem at all, you know. And if you read with that attitude, it actually becomes very fun. And like you know, you're always making notes, you know, so you can always like read and make a few notes what you don't understand and ask some questions, and then it stays exciting instead of being something that we pressure ourselves, which we get used to because we all move through the modern system of education, which is a very different goal and a way of approaching learning, which differs from the Bhagavatam style, which is more traditional and just based on exposure. That makes sense?
Thank you.
Any other questions we have? Yes, right at the back.
Hare Krishna. Thank you for giving class.
Thank you.
My question would be, is there ever an appropriate time to use measured, perhaps anger or something like this, where it's not in control of us, but we're utilizing it as a tool?
Yeah, very good question, and always, yeah, important to point that out as well. So, all of these things, and we see everything has its place, and the main thing is that it just shouldn't take over. So anger, for example, we see that in the Bhagavad Gita, and once since Krishna was inciting Arjuna to anger, I mean, how can you fight if there's no anger? You know? So when there's injustice in the world, so many things, anger has to be there. You know? You have to stand up. If you see someone is doing something that's wrong, anger is the force that propels you forward to address the situation. But so same thing with fear also. Fear is not bad. If you have people that have no fear, they can actually end up in extremely dangerous situations. You know? So certain drugs and stuff you can take, and then you can do all kinds of crazy stuff because you don't have the natural fear that's there. So yes, these things are also there with a purpose, and but it's always about having them to a point where we can use them, and not that they use us. And that is a challenge. So it's dangerous energies to work with, but good point. You cannot avoid it completely, and we see that. There's an interesting story with Prabhupada once. They were at a temple and they were doing a temple opening, and the people, the devotees who started the temple, they totally screwed it up. It was a total screw up. Just like they didn't organize things properly, things weren't there. It was very badly organized, very badly managed, very embarrassing because there was always just reporters there as well. So people were just seeing, it was just, a very badly organized event. And Prabhupada got very angry. Yeah, he was very angry because it was, wasn't done properly. So he was angry and like speaking to people and like addressing things, wanted to get things done properly. And then there was this little boy in the audience, and he pointed and he looked at Prabhupada. He told Prabhupada, he said, "Don't get angry, chant Hare Krishna." Because the little boy heard the instructions. And then what Prabhupada did is Prabhupada stopped, and then he said, "Yes, actually that's a very good idea." And then Prabhupada took out his bead and he started chanting, So even though he was angry, but you could see at any moment you could just switch it off, and he's like, "Okay, it's true. I've done what I needed to do." So using these energies is very important, and we cannot. They have their purpose, and it's just about keeping them in their purpose and not having them overrun our lives where it becomes out of proportion with what they should be doing. Very nice question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, Champagavata.
Thank you for such a wonderful class. And everything you said was so beautiful. My question is, you spoke a lot about the kind of the dangers of our material attachments and emotions overtaking us. And when we transfer our attachment from the material to the spiritual, we fill ourselves up with light and experience more joy. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more of how emotions can be used in spiritual practice, and also what are spiritual emotions like? Like if we understand what the negative is, what is the positive like?
Yeah, so as we said here, attachment directed to the temporary is the cause of all our difficulties, but that same attachment when directed towards the eternal, it opens up spiritual experience. And it's, in one sense, the higher levels of spiritual experience, if we look at like mystics and people who have these experiences that go way beyond even stuff that we can understand. So that's one thing, that's very high. But even now, even many spiritual experiences, legitimate transcendental experiences are open to us, even here, even though we're not like highly elevated mystics. But as I said, a deep care and concern for other people's spiritual welfare, a kind of kindness that you can manifest that comes from spiritually understanding how this other being is just like you are. So all those things are examples of it's spiritual experiences, because it's an experience that is stemming from spiritual understanding, from transcendental knowledge. And same thing when it comes to happiness. Like the happiness when we come together and we chant kirtan, there's a certain kind of relief and a happiness that comes from that. That is spiritual, it's a spiritual experience. It's not a purely sensory experience where we're just experiencing a mundane enjoyment. So I think just by engaging with the process of spiritual consciousness, like engaging with the practices, the spiritual experiences come as a natural corollary, and we will be able to experience them very quickly in the beginning. And they will just deepen as time goes by. But Andrew, thank you so much for your patience. Grantara Srimad Bhagavatam Ki.
Hari Vilas Prabhu Ki. Prabhupada Ki. Thank you so much. So now we will have kirtan, an arati for the deity. So we'll just move these chairs, can stay as they are. We'll just move these red cushions to the side, and everyone come forward so we can sing and maybe dance for the deities.
Jai Vishnu Para Paramahamsa Parivajakacha Astotra Sata Shishimad Divine Grace Shri Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada Ki Jai Vishnu Para Paramahamsa Parivajakacha Astotra Sata Shishimad Divine Grace Shri Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Swami Maharaj Prabhupada Ki Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda Ki Namacharya Shri Hari Vilas Thakur Ki प्रेम से कहो श्री कृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैत गदाधर शिवसारी गौर भक्त वृंद की श्री श्री राधा कृष्ण गोपी गोपीनाथ श्याम कुंद राध कुंद गिरि गोवर्धन की श्री वृंदावन धाम की श्री मायापुर नवद्वीप धाम की गंगामय की जमुनामय की भक्ति देवी की श्रीमती तुलसी महारानी की समवेत भक्त वृंद की घोर प्रेमानंदे all glory to the assembled lotus. All glory to the assembled lotus. All glory to the assembled lotus. All glory to Shri Guru, Shri Ranga, all glory to Shri Prabhupada. Namaste, Jaya Shri Hari
Prabhupada, thank you so much, Hari Vilas, and everyone for being here. This happens every Sunday, this Bhagavat Sravanam program. Please make this your home, your family, and your program. So next Sunday we actually have Anupam Das. He's going to be giving the Bhagavat Sravana. I think it actually may be his first time going. I'm very excited. I had to work it out a little bit with him, but there will definitely be aspects of book distribution spoken about next Sunday, because he does that service very, very actively for a long period of time and has a lot of experiences and inspirations. We'll weave the Srimad Bhagavatam in there somehow. And then also we have a Bhagavad Gita recitation on Friday, the 13th of December, at 4 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. For celebrating Gita Jayanti. So please come for that. And we also have the 6-hour kirtan. If you love kirtan and you want to come for 6 hours, and if you can't come for 6 hours, come for 30 minutes, whatever amount of time you can. That's this coming Saturday, December 14th from 4 to 10 p.m. And that's all I have for you all today. We have a beautiful prasadam lunch served in the back. Raj, don't go anywhere. We have a beautiful Bhagavat Sravana team, and including Raj and so many others. We have an amazing volunteer team who they transfer the prasadam. Also, a lot of times Raj cooks the prasadam with the cooks in the kitchen. Not everybody knows that. And serve the prasadam and help clean up after. If anyone wants to help Raj and our team today with any part of the serving or the cleaning, you can see her. Or if you want to join the team in the future, you can also see our team. And we just really want to appreciate them and all the wonderful service that they do and the beautiful devotees that they are. So we do have lunch, everyone in the back of the temple room. Thank you so much. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.